Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. So I'm Nathaniel Deutsch. I'm the faculty director of the Humanities Institute, and I want to welcome everybody, along with the managing director of the Humanities Institute, Irena Polic, who's here in the front row. I also want to thank Kumbwa for co-hosting this event with us tonight. We're really looking forward to it. So this is the latest installment of something called Questions That Matter. I see some familiar faces, so I know some of you have been here before. Welcome once again, and to those who have never been here. This is a series that the Humanities Institute has been putting on for a number of years where we engage questions that we think matter to everybody, and we have faculty, usually faculty from different divisions within the university speaking to one another. Tonight is a little different because we have speakers from outside of the university speaking with one of the faculty at UC Santa Cruz, who I will be introducing in a second. We've talked about things like freedom and race, cosmos, anger and politics, and tonight we have another really important topic, a set of topics that we'll be talking about. For the last couple of years, Questions That Matter has been funded by a $1.5 million grant from the Mellon Foundation, and every year we choose a different theme to focus on. This year is futures, and that has helped to organize the topic for this evening. Tonight is an especially kind of auspicious and happy moment for us at the Institute because it is the inaugural event for the Center for the Middle East and North Africa, newly created center at UC Santa Cruz, which we think is so important given what's going on in the world to have a hub to study that and to have this kind of programming here in Santa Cruz. And thank you. And tonight, I'm going to introduce the founding director of the center. This is Professor Jennifer Derr, and I've written out a bio for her. Unfortunately, I just realized after the fact that I am now farsighted, so I'm going to have to try to read this. I'm still getting used to that.
Could be a creative bio.
Yeah, you can correct me if I make any terrible gaffes here. She's a professor of history. I know that. I don't need to read that because we're in the same department. She has a BA in biological sciences from Stanford. That's going to become relevant when I describe her work. It's really stunning work that brings together environmental science, medicine, and political economy in the Middle East and especially in Egypt. Her first book, The Lived Nile, Environment, Disease, and Material Colonial Economy in Egypt, was published by Stanford University Press. It's been getting wonderful reviews. Her second book project is called The Liver in Egypt, Productions of an Organ Through 20th Century... I think it's amazing. Through 20th century public health and political economy. And very recently, Jennifer received a 5-year career award from the National Science Foundation, which is a really big deal. Very few people get this. To work on the history of science at the interface of biomedical and environmental concerns. So Jennifer, thank you for serving as the director, and she's going to now take over and introduce the rest of the event.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel, and thank you all of you for being here. It's such a pleasure and such an honor to stand before you tonight. There has long been a desire at UC Santa Cruz to establish a center for the Middle East and North Africa. So this feels like a real moment of joy and a real moment of triumph. I want to just recognize before we start tonight that the faculty members associated with our center at Santa Cruz have some of the most innovative and thoughtful and diverse research foci of any Middle East and North African studies center in the country. So my hope is that for you as a community, you'll be exposed to this as we continue to engage in programming. I also want to recognize that students at UC Santa Cruz have long asked for training in Middle Eastern languages and more programming connected to the Middle East and North Africa. So I hope that this is a tremendous opportunity for them to engage the region on which I work. So before I start tonight in full, I need to say thank you to a number of people. So I want to start by thanking Marika and Jeff Rothschild for their tremendous generosity. I also want to thank Arena Polic and Nathaniel Deutsch of the Humanities Institute for all of their help and support with this event, which was considerable. Jessica Guild at the Humanities Institute did all of the organizing for this event. I also want to thank Terry Burke, Mayanthi Fernando, and Lisa Rofel, who really helped to lay the groundwork for the establishing of a Center for the Middle East and North Africa at Santa Cruz. And finally, I want to thank all of the staff and the students associated with the Humanities Institute and Learning Technologies, and also the Kumbwa Jazz Center. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers and tell you a little bit about what will happen tonight. So our program tonight will be divided into two pieces. The first piece will consist of a conversation between me and our guests, and the second piece of the program will consist of a question and answer session. So I promise you that all of your deep and burning questions about our conversation will be answered in time tonight. So before I bring our speakers out onto stage, I want to introduce them to you and tell you who they are. So our first speaker is Hannah Allam. Hannah is a national security correspondent for National Public Radio. Before she came to NPR, she worked at BuzzFeed News, covering questions related to Islam in the United States. I first encountered Hannah when I was living in Cairo, where she spent a decade living in the Middle East and working for McClatchy News. She was the Baghdad bureau chief during the Iraq War for McClatchy. She was also the Cairo bureau chief during the Arab Spring for McClatchy. Hannah has won a number of awards acknowledging her work. So she's been awarded a Polk Award as part of a McClatchy team that reported on the war in Syria. She also has won an award from the Overseas Press Club for her coverage of Iraqi death squads. She also was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. Our second guest for the night is Leila Fadel. Leila is a national correspondent also at NPR who works on questions of race, culture, and diversity. Before Leila came to the United States to do reporting, she was a correspondent in Egypt for NPR, where she reported on the uprisings that comprised the Arab Spring and also the aftermath of those uprisings. Leila was also the bureau chief for the Washington Post in Cairo. Like Hannah, Leila has also been awarded numerous times for the journalism that she's done. So Leila also won a Polk Award. She won an award from the Overseas Press Club. She also most recently won a Gracie Award. So please help me in welcoming Leila and Hannah to the stage. So I want to start our conversation tonight by talking about some of your experiences during the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq, in terms of the practice of journalism, was a kind of watershed moment in a lot of ways. So it was a moment in which we saw journalists embedding with the American military and doing much of their reporting from that position of the embed. It was also a period in which we saw journalists become the victims of kidnappings and a new sense of threat arise. And in addition to that, but also on that same point, Iraqi journalists and translators and fixers, many lost their lives in reporting this war. And so, I know that both of you arrived in Iraq when you were young journalists, and I wanted to talk to you about what the experience of reporting that war was, how journalism was practiced, how you did your work in the field.
Sure, yeah. First of all, thanks for coming tonight, and thanks for having us. Thanks to the Humanities Institute and to the university. And when you work in this field and on some of these topics, you're often dealing with really old, entrenched institutions. So it's actually really exciting to be here at an inaugural event for your center. So a big Alf Mabruk. And if I were feeling bolder, I might do a Zagruta like Shakira at the Super Bowl.
Introducing it to the world.
I can't top that, though. So I'll just say Mabruk. We were babies when we went to Iraq. 25, 26, I think. And it really, for me, it was an outgrowth of kind of this sudden interest in the Middle East, it was kind of covering, U.S. Muslims who went from being sort of invisible minority to being hyper-visible the day after 9/11. And so it was, the way I tell the story, because kind of felt, at the time at a newsroom in Minnesota, that, the editors were trying to make sense of all this, and we're looking around the newsroom and we're like, oh, we have one, and it really kind of felt like that. And so that sort of set my trajectory. I mean, I was covering courts and then put my hand up when, there was this big push to go to send people overseas. So I went first as just a reporter, did a 3-month tour there and thought, wow, this is an amazing story. This is, what an incredible seat to history to be here. Then I came back as a bureau chief, and it's still an incredible story. You still felt extremely lucky to be there and witnessing it. But I have to say, I was as concerned about security as I was about story, and especially to be this young bureau chief, kind of hazed. I mean, they left a sign on my door, some, other colleagues joking, saying, Fisher Price, my first bureau. I mean, it was, so there was an element of being underestimated, I think, probably, for both of us.
We had a very similar start to our careers. Actually, I was an intern in St. Paul, Minnesota, and she was my assigned mentor. Because, I think they were like, you guys are both Arab Americans.
Arab, same.
So she went off to run that bureau, and I eventually did the same thing, visited, and then eventually took that bureau over from her and lived there as well for about 5 years. And I think it felt the same way, this incredible ability to bear witness and the incredible responsibility of it, which was sometimes I felt debilitating because you understood that you were the one that was going to portray what this huge foreign policy decision was doing to a different country. And you wanted to do that with the respect to the country itself versus just telling the story of what policy is, but who people are. Mm-hmm. And then you were left with the decision of what is too much of a risk and what is a risk worth taking, not for just your own life, but a staff of people working there with you. Iraqis who risk their lives every day to work with us because we were no longer seen as neutral observers. And we were targeted as American journalists and as Iraqi journalists working with American journalists. And they took that risk knowing the risk because they also wanted to tell the stories of their country. So making those decisions every day, and I look back and I do think, what decisions were the wrong ones? They had gone the wrong way, and I thank God that we didn't lose anybody from a decision we made. We did lose a colleague, an Iraqi colleague, from an American sniper who made the decision to take a shot that took somebody's father and somebody's provider and a colleague of ours.
That's right.
And so, I think it was the first time that we were making decisions, security decisions that were as high as our story decisions, and then trying to make sure that we didn't build our walls so high that we couldn't tell stories anymore, because the walls then divided us from the communities and the neighborhoods that we had to get into and make sure we reflected. And so I was really proud to be part of Knight Ridder and then McClatchy's bureau because we did what I felt was a well-rounded job. We had people embedded with the US military to tell that part of the story, but we always had the person on the other side to tell the story of what it was like to be outside of those tanks.
And one of the really cool things, I guess, about sort of, when we weren't the New York Times, we weren't the Wall Street Journal, so we didn't have some of that top tier access. So it really becomes, how can you tell this story to your readers? And our readers were at the time were, at newspapers across the country. It wasn't a sort of rarefied New Yorker readership or something like that. It was towns, base towns, college towns, towns across the South and the Midwest, wherever McClatchy had a newspaper. And so it became, okay, how can we compete? We're young, we're scrappy, we're outmatched, out-resourced, so what can we do? What we do know is we know this culture, we know the religion in the region, and we have some access there, so that's good. We can also hire the best Iraqi staffers and really let them shine. And in essence, we had this opportunity to not only cover this war, but we had an opportunity to build the kind of bureau that we didn't see. And to be over there the first time and to see this sort of, I don't know, the word that comes to mind is colonial, when to watch, Western reporters swanning by the pool saying, Habibi, bring me a beer, It was really just, it felt icky. And so Leila and I and others, we wanted a different kind of bureau. We wanted one where our Iraqi colleagues would get contributing lines, bylines. We didn't want to be the kind of Western correspondents that landed somewhere, sucked up all the knowledge, and put it out. To me, that's theft. And so I'm proud of the work we did on that. I'm proud of the fact that we had probably the first sort of very lightly edited blog by Iraqi civilians in their own voices. Yeah. And the way that resonated with readers to have this sort of unfiltered view of civilian life in the war, if they didn't post for a while, we'd have people writing in saying, where are they? Are they okay? I mean, it became like a telenovela. I mean, you're following.
Because it was daily and
it's daily. And it was very close to the ground. So those are some of the, just to be able to see, Yasser Salahi, bless his soul, he was the one who was killed by a sniper. He had arrived, he was a doctor by training, and he shows up at the bureau, impeccable English, heart for days, ambition for days, just wanted to go. We send him out. He was incredible, but he couldn't forget his doctor roots. So this is the kind of guy that, I would say, call him and say, Yasser, we're on deadline, what have you got from the car bombing scene? And he'd say, I'm so sorry, Hannah. I was doing sutures, taking notes, doing sutures, taking notes. And so these were the kinds of frontline, amazing people that, I really felt strongly about having those voices in. And because we didn't have, sort of generals and the ambassador popping over every night, those were the kinds of stories that we were able to break when you're close to the ground and close to the people of a country.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I think you brought up the issue of the pool and the reporters by the pool. Yeah. And there was a lot of press at the time about what life was like in the green zone, right?
Right. Which we should, this is kind of, we never lived in the green zone.
And most journalists did.
Most journalists did not.
I would say the majority of us lived outside the green zone. We did live in fortified.
Absolutely.
We had blast walls. We were bombed twice in the time that I lived there. Our compounds was targeted specifically, but we didn't have to go through the red tape of the green zone. We lived in a neighborhood, and as much as we could safely, we tried to live a normal life and get out to places that other people wouldn't. And I was always really proud of our work because I felt like we got out into communities more than most journalists did. And I do think that's a little bit of a misnomer for all of us that lived there for long periods of time, because most bureaus try to do that sort of double, having the embedded reporter, but also having people out telling stories. And I can't think of anybody more than Anthony Shadid, who also lost his life in Syria, who did that. And I think of the blog, for example, we had a colleague, Sahar, who lost her son in Crossfire when she came to us. And she wrote this beautiful blog that has stuck with me forever called Square Windows. And it was about looking through the windows of American tanks and realizing that they had the same baby fat that her son had when he died at 17, 18. And realizing that they had the sort of same interests the time that the soldiers raided her home and found the same video games that they played themselves, that her sons played. And so those were the moments that I feel like our reporting was so important, because there is a lot of tendency to want to otherize and feel that somebody is different than you, and that's why it's like that over there. And that's where I really had so much pride in the work that we all did as a team.
And did you feel like as the war evolved and developed, did the act of doing journalism also evolve?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it did. I mean, I used to think of Iraq as the incredible shrinking country because,
Yeah.
you know, when I first went in 2003, it's like something happened in Kirkuk in, you know, the north. Let's go to Kirkuk.
Yeah.
Something happened in Nasiriyah in the south. Let's roll to Nasiriyah. And then it became, okay, all right, we can go to Najaf. All right, well, we can go to Baghdad. Okay, we can go to this side of Baghdad.
Yeah.
Okay, we can go to this neighborhood. Okay, we have to call
Yeah.
sources. And that was really hard. And I mean, it never got to the point where we were, you know, paralyzed. We weren't immobile. I mean, we always went out, but the risks became much, much more calculated. The stakes were much higher. And yeah, I mean, and to live with that kind of current of fear, it also, you know, kind of, you have to take breaks, you have to think about it. I mean, I found myself doing things like, you know, at the height of the sectarian war, for example, any interview I went out to do, I would make sure that my room was super clean at the hotel, because if anything happened to me, I didn't want them to talk about my dirty clothes on the floor. Like, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like, that's not a normal thought for your job. Like, you know, so yeah, you have to like check yourself, pace yourself.
And then we did sort of litmus tests when we thought, okay, well, maybe we'll try to go back to this neighborhood that was the no-go zone. I remember doing a drive across Anbar province, which had been no-go for us forever. And in 2008, we're like, let's try it. So we literally just drove across the province and wrote about what we saw till we got to the Jordanian border, which we hadn't done in years. And I remember getting to the border safe and sound, handing them my American passport, and the border crossing guard was like, I'm going to write Lebanese. And we crossed into Jordan. But it also gave a perspective into a province that we had been calling into or depending on our brave reporter out there for years. And so it became this sort of test of where can we go, how long can we stay? Oh, it's been 20 minutes. People are going to know, not that a foreigner is in the neighborhood, but a stranger is in the neighborhood. Yeah. Everybody knew who was supposed to be where when. And so it became this sort of dance of how long can I stay to get enough information to try to tell a nuanced story without hurting anybody in the process, myself or others, including the people we were interviewing.
So I want to shift gears a little bit and think about the sort of next large media moment in the region, which was the set of uprisings that comprised the Arab Spring. And, you know, I raise this both because I mean, we were all in the region around that time, and at least in the early days of those uprisings, many of them felt very, very hopeful, right? So Egypt in the early days of the revolution.
I mean, I had moved to Cairo 2 weeks before their uprising because I needed a break because I was so tired from Iraq. I was like, nothing ever happens there.
That's what I thought. I moved there after Iraq, and I was like, this will be so nice. I'll go, you know, I want to see what's going on in Nubia.
Nails,
I was like, I'm going to
2
go
weeks.
to Luxor. Yeah. No.
Sorry.
Yeah. I just declared. So I was
out.
on maternity leave, actually. I just had my son, Bilal, and I was on maternity leave, and I had already covered the abortive attempt 2005, the Kifaya movement, which was quickly put down. And I had seen how brutal and nasty and quickly that was put down. So, you know, there I am. I'm exercising on my maternity leave, and the gym had a view of, you know, the street that leads to downtown to Tahrir, and I saw people with their picket signs, and I thought, oh, bless their hearts, you know, they're going to give it another go. And by the end of that day, I was off maternity leave.
Yeah. I was covering the Lebanese government collapse when that was news. It's no longer news ever. But at the time, that was like front page, and I kept saying, should I go back in the morning? Should I go back to Cairo? They're like, no, it's fine. And then about 11 p.m., they're like, we need a front page story and get on a plane. Yeah. So,
but to your point about it being hopeful at the time, I've seriously never covered anything like this in my life. Yeah. Like, it was electrifying. It was a moment, like, it's so hard because the counter-revolution has been so complete that it's hard to remember exactly how momentous it was at the time. You know, and I've always, you know, any chance I get, I try to remind people that, you know, this labeling it a Twitter revolution or a Facebook revolution really doesn't do it justice. I mean, I just remember walking in those very, very early days with small groups of protesters calling up to the people who were on the balconies looking down, housewives and children and day laborers, just kind of looking down and seeing, and then they'd say, come on, there's safety in numbers, come with us. And you would see, like the Pied Piper, they'd just, people would come down and join, and it was organic, and they weren't organized only by Facebook. They saw their neighbors going, and they were emboldened. And so it was real. And, I guess all of this to say, to have seen it so hopeful and to feel the chill that comes over you when thousands and thousands of people are chanting the same thing and falling silent at the same time, and the discipline in Egypt, where you've lived there, it's a pretty chaotic, wild place. Yeah. And so to see that, and now to see how far it's fallen, it's honestly been, as a journalist, very hard to cover, but as an Egyptian American, also the heartbreak of my life.
Yeah.
It was like the birth of something, the birth of citizenship, the birth of agency in places that for so long people had just given up on the idea that they somehow had a say to influence their government, that their elections were rigged if there were elections at all. Egypt being one of the places where, yes, people voted, but everybody knew the outcome of the 99% in favor, yes. And it did feel to watch, I remember when Mubarak gave his step down, when it was announced that he would be going, seeing this 62-year-old professor weeping. His granddaughter had been born that day, because it was the first time, and now it's almost cliche, but yes, to hold your head up high, that was among the chants. And it is heartbreaking to look at where it is today because of that sense of hope. But history may tell us a different story than what we see today. So
how do you, as a journalist and as an observer and a writer of these kinds of scenes, balance the sense of emotion and the sense of attachment that you might have during these moments, right? So how do you see your role, and how do you see the emotions that might be associated with that role or work against that?
Well, when you're in the moment, it's just, you've got the deadline looming, and you've really got to produce, and you've got to just buckle down and be professional. And then a lot of times I would find myself, something totally random later would just set me bawling. You did, because makes you, later it sinks in what you've seen when the adrenaline wears off and you've filed. And I remember the night Mubarak stepped down, I filed my story, my journalist hat is off, and I called my dad, who's Egyptian, and he's from Suez, where the first, person who died from the revolution was from there. And I said, well, Baba, Dad, Mabruk, congratulations, Mubarak's gone. And I just, Leila's heard this story. I'm like, he said, Mabruk for what? A military coup? And I was like, God, what a buzzkill. Like, could you be happy for one day? And of course, he was right. Yeah. And he studied history, and he knew what the important institutions were in that country, and it's the military. And I think that has been, as American observers, and I would include myself and probably the media, when we parachute in somewhere and we don't understand what the real power brokers are, it's why the Americans were late to understand that it wasn't Baghdad, it's Najaf, in Iraq, that, where is the real power center? So yeah, it was hard to, you're seeing people who were so hopeful, and like Leila said, people who had just the little indignities of daily life had just gotten too much. And here they're finally doing something, and all the promise of the square was there. And to have that dashed and hijacked by different groups and exploited in different ways, it's hard to cover that story. But
it's cliche, but we are the first draft of history, right? We're covering what we're seeing, we're portraying what we're seeing, and there are moments, we covered the Day of Rage out of Suez, and at that time, I remember it got pretty ugly, and we signaled to this family to help us get up to their apartment, and we watched it from above because it became a clash between police protesters breaking people out of prison, and we were watching it all from above, and this is a place where ambulances drove over those protesters.
We watched the complete razing of a police station before our eyes.
We did. And I remember people coming out with like fridges and blankets from the detention center. And then in the hallway was a policeman who was weeping because nobody would let him in to an apartment to protect him from the protesters. And I think back to that day because in the end, everybody on all sides of this were Egyptian. And yes, there were millions of people out protesting, but there were millions of people who were not. And so in all of those moments, you do want to send a story home that gets at the daily indignities, the toppling of fear, breaking a wall, but you also want to make sure you're doing that sort of fully. And that's not always going to happen at every story. And sometimes we get things wrong. And looking back, you think, I would have written a different story if I know what I knew today.
So since both of you have come back to the United States and have been working in the United States, you have both done journalism concerning Muslim communities in the United States. And I was wondering if you could talk about that work, talk about some of the things you've learned, some of the particularities of doing that kind of work in the United States.
Yeah, well, I had been at McClatchy and was covering basically foreign affairs, diplomacy, but then in the run-up to the 2016 election, Muslims were singled out, particularly by the Trump campaign, but I think we should also remember that even the Clinton campaign would use language like, they're our first line of defense. I mean, it was still looking at Muslims, 3.5, 3.8, whatever million Americans, as through solely a security lens. And so I thought, maybe I could do some stories on that. Later, BuzzFeed hired me for a job that they had initially advertised as the Islamophobia reporter. And that was, I was grateful for the job. It was an incredible platform to look at these issues, but I said, we've got to do something about the name. That's, again, it's well-meaning. It's to signal that, yes, these things happening to Muslims are among the most urgent civil rights questions of our time. Religious freedom, all of that gets right to who's a citizen in this country. But there's so much more to Muslim life than that. So can we just call it Muslim life? And then I was able to kind of look at two different things happening among American Muslims. And I mean, the first I was look at it, sort of the external pressures. So travel ban, hate crimes, the vilification, all of that kind of stuff. But then also the internal conversations that were going on about really long-standing issues of women's roles and leadership in Muslim life, the fact that so many imams are still foreign-born, the long-standing racism within Muslim communities and how that was or wasn't being dealt with. So yes, and when you're kind of doing both, I mean, yeah, it feels good. You're not only singling out one community when something bad happens. I mean, that was what I was just, it wasn't, I didn't see the role as either, I'm not writing Valentines and trying to remake the image of a maligned community. No. But nor was I saying, this is a community that must be dealt with in only a way that involves national security. I was trying to find a balance. And I think that's all any community would want, is stories where they just recognize a truth, not that it's so distorted that they don't recognize themselves.
Exactly. I guess, yeah, that's the same. I mean, the thing that I think about a lot is for a lot of minority communities who feel that they get one storyline, they never get to talk about all the other things that affect them as humans, whether it's, balancing your budget, dealing with family issues, Me Too,
yeah.
All of the societal questions that have been coming up in all facets of our country. I feel like a lot of American Muslims felt like they were being left behind in that conversation because they didn't feel the luxury of being able to talk about those things in their communities when outside of their communities they felt under attack. And this isn't an issue of one side or the other attacking them. They felt that same idea. Everything was about being victim or villain and never just about being them. And so we sort of tackled that as well at NPR. And the other beautiful thing about covering American Muslims is the plethora of cultures and practice that exist here that exists nowhere else in this way, because people hail from 75 countries, plus the rich Black Muslim culture that exists here.
I would
And
urge
so-
you all to, I'd have to brag on you, Leila. She wrote a beautiful story for National Geographic that had, the audio component for NPR that was just, it was such an incredible, if you read one thing or want to familiarize yourselves with American Muslims through one piece, I would definitely point to that, because it was like, yes, like there's a Bosnian girls choir and, like all these different
And for
parts
me,
of
it was-
American Muslim life.
And your work is this. It felt like an amazing opportunity to just let people be seen.
Yeah.
And that's not unique to American Muslims. There's so many communities right now in the United States that feel that they get one storyline, whether it's immigration or gun violence or fill in the blank. And so giving people the opportunity to feel that they're reflected as they are versus the way they're seen, that's a pretty amazing thing to get to allow for people to have. And it's also not just a race or religion thing. Conservatives feel like they're not necessarily reflected in certain ways. Liberals feel that way. Like and that's where I feel NPR, at least we try to give voice to a lot of different parts of our country that don't feel they're seeing themselves.
So I wanted to talk to you about your experiences right when you moved to Las Vegas after the Las Vegas shooting.
Right before, yeah.
Or right before
Yeah.
the shooting. And what was it like to report an incident of mass violence like that from the United States? Did it feel like reporting that you had done earlier in your career?
Yeah.
Were there...
So since moving back to the U.S., I've been reporting in the U.S. now for 2 years, and I want to say I have covered maybe half a dozen incidents of mass violence because I share them with colleagues, not because that's how many there have been. And I have now covered, and I remember covering that first mass shooting, which, the biggest one incident of mass violence in modern American history, now it sounds, but at that time, I thought, this isn't why I moved back. I didn't move back. I didn't go to the Middle East to cover mass violence, and I didn't move back to do that either. And it became almost normal in the same way that Baghdad bombings became normal, where we sat and we said, how big was it? How many people were killed? To make the decision on whether we covered it or not. And now that's how it feels in the States when it comes to mass violence, mass shootings. We say, how big was it? How many people were killed? Because they are happening almost daily. And I wrote a piece for NPR about the way that it almost follows this tragic script, that you get to these incidents and you find these distraught families looking for their loved ones. Did they survive? Are they okay? Are they at the hospital? Everything's closed off. The roads are a mess. The sheriff, the police chief that comes out and says, I never thought it would happen here. The candlelight vigils, the people that say now is not the time to talk about politics when it comes to issues of gun control. And then people kind of move on and it happens again. And now I've covered shootings where people will say, oh, I survived the Las Vegas shooting. Oh, I was also in the Thousand Oaks shooting. A parent who says, my kid survived this one but didn't survive that one. And so it is really quite heartbreaking. And it's also in the same way when I thought about covering Syria or Iraq, about how to cover it in a way where people don't say, oh, another one, but to see it individually and see the people involved in it individually. So getting creative about the way we cover these things and looking at them from different angles, that's not just that same sort of tragic script that it follows.
So I wanted to ask both of you, we're in a very particular moment in American history vis-a-vis journalism, right? So you and I were joking earlier because there's a kind of classic antagonism between academics and journalists.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
So we think
Yes.
you do your work too quickly.
Yes, and
you
we
know.
leave out all
You
the
think
context.
we can never speak
Yes,
to the
of course.
point.
Yes, that's right. 1,500 words.
Exactly. And yet, in this moment, I find myself defending, being a great defender of
Why,
journalists.
thank you. We need it.
Yeah.
But I did want to talk to you about how has your work changed, or how do you encounter this when you do your reporting in the field? The fact that the press, there are so many schisms, there are so many divisions, and there are many people that question whether journalists are good actors, right? Like whether they're doing work with integrity. And I was just, I always think, how does this come up in the daily work of reporting?
I remember when we lived in Cairo, I'd have this annual Halloween party. And one year, another journalist came as hidden hands. And she had handprints, sort of all over. And it was a reference to, I guess it was Sisi, it must have been, in Egypt, blaming all of this unrest. It's from the hidden hands of, those journalists and those foreign interests and the hidden hands. So someone actually came as hidden hands. Now, fast forward, it's like I hear that same sort of level of conspiracy, and there's hidden hands and hidden agendas, and you're all in cahoots. And, it's really disappointing, obviously. I mean, it feels like a failure of news literacy. Do we not show our work enough? Are we not transparent enough? It's a real crisis of disinformation. And, I cover extremism, and it just goes hand in hand. The conspiracy theories, then, all it takes is one person to act on those, as we saw at, the pizza parlor where I take my son in D.C. So, it's... that feels scary. It is really hard. If you've been following, you've seen that NPR has had a rough week with this in particular. And it's been great to see that NPR has stood beside Mary Louise Kelly and Michelle, who, it's, yes, to have the top diplomat of a nation sort of malign you, call you a liar, that's always uncomfortable. NPR handles the official responses, but it's chilling. And then to see follow-up interviews where that is defended as a perfect response or something like that, it just means that it's harder when we go overseas and report press freedom issues. And it calls into question our credibility on these issues, our moral high ground on these issues, things like that. I remember I saw it. It's not new. I think it's been hastened in the past several years. But I would see that kind of double standard or questioning of American double standards on press freedoms, even when traveling, for example, with Secretary Kerry to reopen the embassy in Havana. Where he was trying to lecture on human rights and press freedoms, and at the time it was like I think Ferguson or things like that, and the Cuban foreign minister stood right there and said, "Oh, really? And how about da 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 da?" And started, and so that's the kind of real way it plays out in diplomacy and on our standing internationally.
It's one thing to kill us individually, but to undermine the industry as a whole, then you have no cornerstone anymore. And so disinformation is a challenge that every newsroom is talking about, because whether we're fact-based or not, which we are, it's more about people believing and supporting the institutions that do tell, or at least attempt to tell, objective truths about what's going on in our country and the world. And if you can chip away at that, and that's what we saw in Egypt, where NGOs and free press domestically were fully and completely demonized, that they lost the support of their population and were seen as enemies of the state, a term that we're now very familiar with here. Not because they were enemies of the state, but because they questioned the authority and held people accountable that were in power. And there are very few institutions that still exist like that now in a place like Egypt. And they did. Even under Mubarak, slightly, there were openings. There were red lines that you understood. But now those red lines are so blurry, you're not really sure what you can and can't say, what will get you rated and what will not. And so listen, and that translated very physically in the streets of Cairo, where people would scream at you and grab your microphone because they did believe you were trying to hurt their country. And now those are things that you see here, depending on where you're reporting and how people feel about whatever newspaper or radio outlet you represent. So.
And do you feel like people are less willing to talk to you when you do a story?
It depends.
You know, so I was in Richmond recently for the gun rally, and, you know, people still want their story out. I think people still want to talk. Yes, but that was the first time probably in the US that I felt that fear of being on a mob, you know, where in Egypt you could do a person on the street interview and everything's going great, and then there's just one guy who's like, Israeli spy, and then it's like, you know, it turns and it can get very dangerous very quickly. And that was how I felt in Richmond, surrounded by 22,000 heavily armed gunmen. And I'm in the middle alone. And, you know, one guy was starting to kind of harass me. And later I heard the tape, you know, as I was doing my notes. And I was shocked at how scared my voice sounded in response to him. Because at the time you're on adrenaline. And I was like, gosh, I was scared. I thought he was going to turn the crowd on me in Richmond, you know? And that was, I mean, that whole day, it felt like I could have just been taken up and dropped down into Slaughter City 2006 with all the militiamen in a march. I mean, that was my reference point. That's what it felt like. So yeah, there's that menacing element at times. Not every time, and people are still wanting to talk to you, but it just takes one to kind of turn the tide sometimes.
And this hyper partisanship where everybody feels like they are the right moral high ground, you agree with us, you endorse our, whatever your politics might be, it makes it difficult, especially on specific issues. And individually, people are not difficult to talk to. Like Hannah said, most people want to tell their story. They want to talk about what concerns them, what issues they face. But in those larger crowds, it is easier for things to get lost. And in moments where people are being told the press is the enemy, it does translate. It can translate into something quite frightening.
Yeah.
But day to day, I think the other thing is that whole cancel culture, in the sense that there is only one right answer. And really, it is about different voices and different. And so that's something that's a little bit difficult as well.
In a couple, I guess, almost 2 years ago now, I was still working for BuzzFeed, and I decided, you know, it didn't matter where my beat was at the time, so I decided to go back to my home state of Oklahoma, because I wanted to get out of the Beltway. I wanted to just go somewhere where everyone loves Trump, you know, and the politics, his politics, et cetera, ruby red state. And I just remember one day, and I would always try to work from a different cafe every day so I could just eavesdrop, you know, hear what people are talking about. So at one cafe, I go up to the attendant and I say, you know, hey, do you have a Wi-Fi password? And she said, oh yes, it's media plague, no space. And I was like, okay, right on. And it was like, my gosh, this is like a little cafe in Oklahoma. Why? You know, and that was actually, that little thing was so dismaying to me. Yeah.
So I want to take a pause there and change veins and open our conversation for audience questions. So there should be microphones circulating the floor. I attempted to just call microphones into being magically. So there should be microphones circling the floor. And if you have a question, if you could just raise your hand and I'll be sort of fielding the floor. I forgot my glasses and I'm nearsighted, so, you know, make it a big hand. And we'll hopefully open this for some conversation and some questions. Yes, right here.
I think this is probably a subject that covers two things. One is the safety of journalism and also the extremism. What's your take on what happened with Charlie Hebdo in France and how that reflects another anti-journalism thing that you haven't talked about yet? And just a comment, you kind of went from the uprising to Assisi and you didn't mention the Muslim Brotherhood as if there wasn't a transition. And I'm wondering why you've admitted that.
Well, I think when I alluded to groups that sort of hijacked the agenda or revolution, I mean that was certainly one that was that blamed for that, was late to join and then sort of took it over. That was generally the narrative. So it wasn't omitting them for any reason. I mean, I think that was one of the sort of, when you hear Egyptians talk about it, that's one of the biggest disappointments in this group that had many, many years to prepare for this moment, from inside of prison and outside of prison, and then essentially blew it in the eyes of many by overstepping, by trying to push through constitutional amendments, by just overplaying their hand, and not doing the kind of sort of approach that we've seen, for example, by Islamists in Tunisia.
Which they actively learned from the
Yes.
Muslim Brotherhood's mistakes. And that was, yes, he was the first, by all intensive purposes, freely and fairly elected president, Mohamed Morsi, who's now dead, as we know. And that party made a lot of promises not to take over, and essentially did, and lost their allies both among revolutionaries, but also among the establishment that they thought they could co-opt. And so it went from there, this sort of soft coup with Mubarak that led to this election, to really a full-on coup, which we covered, and ended with a massacre in the middle of a cosmopolitan city like Cairo. And what was so shocking about covering that was that the Muslim Brotherhood had been so fully demonized that people were pretty okay with a massacre in the middle of their city. Not because they're awful people, because they felt that maybe this was what was right for their country, that maybe this party didn't have the right idea for the future of their nation. And I do think about that a lot, because these were people that generally looked like everyone else, that generally had the same faith as everyone else. And so demonization is a very, very powerful and scary thing if people think you're dispensable enough for the good of the country. Because there was between 1,000 and 2,000 people killed in the middle of Cairo. So yeah, not a purposeful omission, but in the short time that we have.
And on the, Charlie Hebdo and the sort of Islamist extremists, I think it's well documented what they think of journalists and aid workers and politicians and, any of the number of people who are targeted. And in fact, it's been really interesting to, even though I've covered Islamist extremists for many, many years, pretty much name a group, and we've either interviewed them, done stories on them, but I guess it's interesting now to, I know they hated everything about me, but there was still if they were Arab, if they were Muslim, if they, there was something, there was a familiarity there. Now, covering hate groups in the U.S. that dehumanize everything, about me as well, it's in a different, it's really been a strange feeling. And I suddenly have actually a lot more appreciation for the risk my totally Western, non-Arab, non-Muslim colleagues had going to the Middle East and really making inroads to interview some of those groups, because now I see from the flip side how very hard it is and how dangerous it is.
And when we talk about Iraq shrinking and shrinking when it came to safety issues, who we were being targeted by were these extremist groups that were taking over swaths of the country, taking advantage of people's dissatisfaction with their situation and allowing for these groups to take over. That's how ISIS flourished in Mosul and in these sort of security vacuums, because people were sort of stuck between full repression and security vacuum, and that's where groups like this flourish. And I don't really cover domestic extremism in the same way, so.
So I think I was thinking about the Charlie Hebdo incident, and one of the questions that I think is, as journalists, do you think there are lines and subjects that shouldn't be reported?
In the sense of?
Well, do you think that in different contexts, how do you think about questions of cultural sensitivity and respect as you move across global contexts?
I mean, I believe in sunshine. I believe that everything should be reported. But I also think about I don't know if this is exactly the question you're asking, but there was a period where a lot of studies showed that by over-publicizing suicide, it inspired more suicide, right? And so there was a decision made as an industry that unless there was a public service to covering these types of deaths, do we cover them? And how do we cover them? In the sense of public interest. And so mass shootings, for example, and these mass violent acts, yes, there's a lot of conversations going on in newsrooms about how to cover them responsibly. How often do we name a person who's from an extremist group or, an individual actor?
Do we even use the word manifesto?
Exactly.
Because does that confer a special status to them that it's just a screed?
Right,
It's
because
a
in the
note.
end, they're looking for fame and
Right.
infamy, and does it inspire other acts of violence? Those are definitely conversations that are going on in our newsroom about where the line is between public service and disservice. Because if 54, 52, 56 people, I guess, killed in Las Vegas, do you just not cover it at all because it might inspire another shooting? No, of course, people want to know. But how much do we cover it? And how much do we give credence to an organization? How much do we, because that is also exactly what a group like ISIS, for example, is looking for when they commit these big acts of violence, where any type of group, any individual actor or group as a whole is looking for the coverage that they ultimately get. So those are definitely conversations that are going on in our newsrooms.
Yes.
I'm wondering, from your Baghdad years, what a professional journalist thought of Riverbend.
Riverbend?
The blogger?
The blogger.
Oh, I don't remember very much. It was a young woman, right? I don't know. I don't remember. I remember that she had an enormous following, but I don't remember really what happened to that. But I do remember that blog, was one of the reasons probably that we thought, there would be this appetite to hear close to the ground stories of Iraqi civilians, and that as important as it was to be embedded with American forces and to watch their conduct, their rules of engagement, how they conduct their operations, how troop morale is, all of that's very, very important. There's also 27 million Iraqi civilians, and that their stories were as important. And so I think that blog was an early example that there could be other kinds of coverage, that there is an appetite for that. But I'm sorry, I don't remember the details of it. Sadly, I've covered probably 6 conflicts since then, and
there are definitely years that feel like
and they're definitely
a month.
that
it
feel
was a blur.
like a blur. But yes, definitely remember the name.
Other hands from the floor. I see one right here and one right here.
Oh, just a question. How do you think our allies, our friends, view our newspapers and our journalism coming out of this country? Do they believe it?
Well, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
We saw how they treated a Washington
yeah,
Post columnist.
Yeah. Look, a lot of the times, for example, in Egypt, we got away with telling certain stories that maybe the local press wouldn't take a risk on because the consequences, frankly, were much more grave for them. And that doesn't include people like Mada Masr, which is still a thriving, independent Egyptian journalism source that's still going on in Egypt. And so there was an active demonization campaign of our work and specific people, depending on what you might have covered and what might have been translated in the local press. And that was because the truth is dangerous when you want to tell a population how to think. And there are openings now that can't be controlled with Twitter and Facebook, which is a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of misinformation that makes our job a lot more difficult. But there are certain countries where people felt like that hidden hand story, you're coming in to tell us how to work in our own country and covering us this way, and this feeling that there was a broad brush. which we very much attempted to not do, to look at the nuances of those countries, but we also had leeway and abilities that maybe the local press didn't get. And we were able to cover their governments and what was happening and the US policy in those places in a way that they couldn't.
So do you think that you would make the argument that the question of political alliances and who is an ally of the United States doesn't necessarily impact what it means to do journalism on the ground?
I mean, of course it does. I mean, day to day, my work is to be an objective observer, right? And it's not to be a purveyor of US policy. That's not my job. But ultimately, the way that people perceive the US and the media that comes from the US is our intervention and alliances in those regions, of course. And so obviously, the way people perceive you in Iran or Saudi Arabia, those are different depending on the alliances between your country and those countries. But I also, pre-Iraq, to be honest, most people really differentiated between being an American and the policy of the government. Iraq changed that because it was a full war and occupation, and because the press descended on it in that way, and it became an easy target. And that definitely shifted. But no, it doesn't. And I also think something has shifted too in the last couple years. I don't know that we necessarily would have seen the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in a foreign embassy this way, with very little
Muted
consequence,
response.
muted response.
Yeah.
And so it also shifts the way we think about our work abroad, because that blue passport was very protective in these countries. You felt like, okay, I've gotten detained in Egypt, I've gotten taken here or there, and gotten myself in bad situations, and I always think, somebody's gonna figure out I'm from the Washington Post or I'm from NPR, and they're gonna realize this is not gonna be great for their country. That measure of protection for us feels gone in some places,
flimsy,
and
if
flimsy.
not gone. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Especially,
that used to mean something. And so
Yeah.
if you can imagine it's that bad for the sort of privileged visiting Western journalist, imagine how bad it's gotten,
Yeah.
you know, for the local journalists. Yeah.
Okay, we had a question here, then I see one here and one here.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you about when you look towards, we're talking about futures and things like that, and in Iraq in particular, but also in Syria, you have all the children that are, and all the people who are left in the wake of the fall of the caliphate. And if you have any thoughts on what is going to become of that. I mean, you talk about this really hopeful time during the Arab Spring, and it was a really hopeful time, and we all had this dream of what could be, but now we have quite the opposite with what's left of it. So since you guys had so much experience in the region and during that time, if you have any insights, currently it's being compared, the process is being compared to Guantanamo in the torture that's being used on people who are accused of affiliation with ISIS.
Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking. I wish I had something hopeful to say, but every one of my sort of sources and friends who work in humanitarian development type roles, that's the alarm they're sounding, is these kids, not just in the, ISIS and, families camps, but I mean, displaced people throughout the region, and indeed throughout the world now, but I mean, definitely there. I mean, no, it's a huge concern. Many of them have lost years of education. They're extremely traumatized. I mean, I just remember interviewing a group of, I think, Syrian kids, and it was a fun, just a happy sort of moment. And then someone came in, and the metal gate clanged really loudly, and they jumped out of their skin, these little kids. And it was just like, at that moment you see what they're living with and what's locked away in their little heads. And it's just like, what do you do with that? And where is it going to go? And how can it be harnessed in a positive way? Is there any hope for them? When third countries won't take them, it's extremely risky to go back. I mean, I'm glomming a lot of people into one. I mean, there's obviously nuances from different camps and countries, but broadly speaking, there's a generation or more that are extremely at risk. And unfortunately, with everything going on in this country, and especially in an election year, it's extraordinarily hard, if not impossible, to even make those stories punch through the maelstrom. It's really hard. Like massive sea change protests are going on in several countries around the Middle East right now, and we might get a little blip of it, or, oh, look, they played Baby Shark in Lebanon, and so that's like, that's good for a news cycle. But I mean, we should be paying attention to where these are going and where they're leading before, even just from, if you're just looking purely from an American interest perspective, before it sort of, we see the consequences play out closer.
And Leila, you've done a lot of reporting on, I feel like, the effect of conflict on families, right?
Yeah.
So you won awards for that in Egypt. You also were doing stories about Yazidi women in Iraq. I feel like you've done a lot of that, looking at aftermath.
I mean, I specifically did pre-ISIS, when Al-Qaeda was the biggest, baddest group around. When they would leave areas, their children, it was quite heartbreaking, because the mothers of their children were pariahs in the communities, and those children were bigger pariahs. I mean, these are children that were left behind a group that has now been shunned and arrested. And what does that do to a child when your mother when you are the shame of your community? These kids, these Yazidi boys that are coming back brainwashed by an organization that has also massacred the men in their society, mass rape of the women. And again, these are entire communities, Muslims, Christians, Yazidis, that are all dealing with the trauma of being ruled by these organizations for a time. And beyond that, there is, like you said, this generational trauma. I did, on the 6-year anniversary of the Iraq War, I decided to profile kids that were born on the day of the invasion. And I went to a bunch of people's homes who had children on that day, and they were all 6 years old at that point. And one child, his name was literally Harb, war in English. And he had grown up in a country that had known nothing but war. And so he interpreted everything through that. Tom and Jerry. Tom the cat were the American tanks in the street that he had to run from in case they accidentally shot. He understood being an American to be somebody who had body armor, tanks, power, and guns. That was his understanding of what American was. He also understood what the insurgents were. The people with guns were the people in power. That was what his understanding was. And that same idea that these children at 6 and 7 can differentiate between what's a grenade, what's a mortar, what's a car bomb. They had seen more bodies than anybody in their lifetime should see, and they interpret life that way. In the way that people work with kids through theater and these types of things, you see them enact what they'd seen outside, whether it's oil slicks in the sea from mortar attacks on certain areas, or, and so this is a generation of traumatized kids, but also a world that is not very welcoming of immigration in this moment, away from, be it conflict or economic poverty. And so it is, I can't imagine being a 7-year-old Syrian kid right now, or a 7-year-old Iraqi kid who had to escape this. And then the irony of the many Iraqis who went to Syria for refuge, and then that turning the tides, and Syrians going to Iraq for refuge from the civil war. So, what is the future of that? I don't know.
So we had a question over here, and then Jody. Yes. The microphone will travel, I promise.
All right. This is pretty open-ended, just because of all your experience with these revolutions, but I'm kind of curious what you think about what's going on in Lebanon, and if there's been lessons learned that can be translated to this situation, or maybe there could be a better outcome.
Oh, man. I mean, Lebanon's kind of, it's interesting because it's not a dictatorship, right? There's like 17 different people who think they are owed everything, and they've stolen all this stuff from the country, and it's on the brink of economic collapse. I mean, this is a country where, at what point it's tiny, but the debt is burdening everyone. But it also has this other overlay of a very delicate sectarian system that has kept it from imploding for ever, and a system that the younger generation is rejecting as a whole. But where does it go from there in this country that's 4 to 6 million people, more Lebanese outside Lebanon than inside Lebanon, that's bleeding money, but has the easiest way to kill these things is to feed off people's fears of alienation and marginalization, and how do you make everybody feel included? So it's difficult because all of these countries are completely different, and the power structures are completely different. In Egypt, it was the military. In Tunisia, it was the labor unions. In Lebanon, it is this sectarian system that has sort of kept everybody in their little box for forever since the Civil War. And so when I look at Lebanon, I think of it as completely different, and it's a petri dish, right? It's a petri dish of the power brokers of the region. It is not happening alone. All of these parties are backed by Saudi Arabia, Iran, the US. You know, all of this is involved, not only in Lebanon, but that was the case in Syria as well. And so at 38 versus 20, 24, and 25, I do look at these a lot more cynically than I did back in 2011, because they're not that simple, and it's very easy for actors to hijack a moment for themselves. You know, there are members of those governments who are today, you know, I just saw a tweet recently from Walid Jumblat, who was talking about the Bernie Sanders campaign against injustice, just like his father's, but this is a man who's been part of a system that's being protested in the streets every day. So, you know, it is interesting to watch, and it's extremely hopeful for lots of people. The Iraqi protests that are going on right now, completely unprecedented in what we ever saw in Iraq, where people have completely turned on their government and the Iranian policies that are going on in Iraq, and this is a largely Arab Shia population that's protesting. So they're fascinating, but the outcome of them we'll see, you know?
And as to your question about, you know, what it, you know, any lessons for here now, I mean, I remember when I first started covering Lebanon, someone telling me, just be suspicious of anyone who can try to position himself as a national leader, because in Lebanon, you're not allowed to get out of your sect or confession. And I've thought about that quote a lot now, because it's hard to see on the American landscape now someone who can transcend the tribalism that we've descended into, and who can be that bigger than party, bigger than culture war, bigger than whatever it is, to transcend and to lead.
Yeah. So, Jody, I'm going to try to call a microphone into existence again.
So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for those of us who have been learning from you since you were in your 20s. It's pretty amazing to sit in a room with you. So thank you. And I actually wanted to ask you about what it's like to do your work as women, and not so much what it's like to do that work in the Middle East, but what it's like to do it here. So Muslim extremism, mass shootings, you've brought up Richmond, you've brought up these cases where I just think, wow, like, what's it like to be there as a woman? You've talked about what it's like to be there as an Arab American, but I wonder about the compounding factor of being in those particular sites, often of violence and masculine violence as a woman.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the Middle East part, it's never been anything but a benefit to be a woman there, because especially in, like, say, a conservative tribal society like Iraq's, you know, I can sit down with tribal sheikhs and listen to their spiel and drink coffee with them, and then I can go to the women's quarters and sit in their bedroom and watch them braid their hair and cook with them and things like that. That's something my male colleagues can never do. So I would land in Baghdad and go get a manicure so I could hear what people are talking about. Or get my hair done. I was in an aerobics class run by this, you know, wild Baathist former Olympian who was like, you know, but I learned a lot. So, I mean, it's never been anything but a benefit, because you have access to half the population that doesn't always get asked about. And that became even more the case when, you know, we had bombing rates of, like, you know, sometimes you'd have 80 people dead today, you know, for many days in a row in a car bomb. Those were usually military-age men, so many of them family, you know, breadwinners. And so if you think of that in terms of 85 people, that's also 85 new widows every day, 85 new female heads of household every day. And so it shifted the demographics, it shifted the power, it shifted a lot of things. And if we didn't talk to women, we wouldn't have gotten that story. Here in this context, it's really interesting. I mean, when I've just been on the road for the past month with far-right militias, mainly the 3%ers. And I feel like, I'm such a curiosity to them, like greetings, and and so it's weird, but there's there's a wariness, a mutual wariness, but also I think some of these groups are so intent on changing their image and rebranding that they sort of go to lengths. I got a chuckle about interviewing the Idaho 3% leader the other day, and I couldn't help but notice he'd, positioned his coffee cup in a way that I could see the Martin Luther King quote on it, and it was just like, we're all good here, and it was, but so I don't know if that was more woman or whatever, but it is, I do find myself like having to like keep up on football and stuff like that to just have something to talk about with my sources. But it's I think there's always, it's also though you just see different sides of a story sometimes. And I remember in Iraq there were always guys that were that would do like what's called the bang bang. They only wanted to do the combat stories and kinetic stories, tactical stories. That's the language that they used. It was how they dressed, and it feels like cosplay. I just think there's just so much more, and I think sometimes as women we could get into those spaces where families live and see a whole different side of it. And honestly, I see it. It's the same here, because I'm covering essentially paramilitary movements, extremist movements, and I'm always interested to see how and where women wield power in those movements. And you'd be surprised, because they actually are quite, for all the, sort of surface misogyny and traditional wife and this and that, and some of the extremist movements that I cover, there's also a lot of really powerful women who have agency, and that's the other thing. I think sometimes when we're talking specifically about extremist movements, we talk about the jihadi bride, or there's these tropes that in their own way are sexist, because there are plenty of women who ideologically just believe that way and have agency and join these groups as well, and we should cover them and hold them to account the same.
I mean, I was once on a stage with Helen Thomas, and she said, "Well, I've never been a man," and that's really true. I've never worked as a man, so I don't know what's
There's
different.
no comparison,
right?
I don't know.
But naturally, I talk to more women because studies have shown that people tend to talk to people that are like them, and so as newsrooms diversify, it's really important that we have more women, that we have young people and old people and people that grew up in different economic classes and races and faiths, because it is a natural inclination to go towards somebody that might seem like they might have had the same experience. And almost by accident, then, you talk to more women. And so I do feel like, I remember at an unnamed organization, that's not the organization I work for now, doing a story, and he's like, "There's so many girls in your story." And I thought, well, they're women, but they're also, like, he only noticed that because the default is not that many women. Sometimes the act of actually reflecting feels revolutionary, because people aren't used to hearing 50-50, or think about other representations, whether it's other races and faiths. They're not used to hearing the actual reflection of what we look like and who we are. And so that's what I think about as being a female journalist, is I talk to women.
I will say, just on a more sobering note, I'm also on the board of the International Women's Media Foundation, and we do a lot of work around female journalist safety online. That is where it's kind of sucks sometimes to be a female journalist, because you get all the nastiness that Twitter can give you and other platforms, but then oftentimes it's sexualized or specifically gendered, and it's never
and also
never
our
feels
voices.
good.
Our voices on the air are criticized
That's
more.
right.
The way that we speak, that is very specific to us. And when things turn nasty, in general, it doesn't that often in conversations. It can often go to the places that it goes to for women, about the way that we act and look and all of those types of things that other people don't, that men don't have to deal with, frankly. And so those are
Even the
definitely-
thing with Mary Louise Kelly, or, our host, dealing with Pompeo. I had a story like that. It was with a very prominent general in Iraq, and I can't name him, but he was so angry that I had uncovered all this missing money that had gone missing under his watch, that he slammed his tray down, he got in my face, he intimidated me, and was yelling at me in ways that later his staff told me I've never seen the boss get that mad at anybody. And I always wondered, if I'd been a guy, would he have done that? Would he have been that aggressive to me? I don't know.
So we're going to take one more question. Yasmin had your hand up, and then we'll be mingling afterwards. And I'll give you future opportunities to interact with Leila and Hannah. Yasmin.
I wanted to reiterate the thanks here. I'm so used to hearing your names on the radio, and it feels like such a privilege to actually see you in person and hopefully meet you later. I wanted to ask you about how do you keep going? How do you keep yourself going? How do you kind of fortify yourself? You're describing very intense human encounters, being part of very intense settings, and I'm just wondering, how do you, in the middle also of kind of a hostility towards media and a sense of blaseness about violence, how do you just deal with that? And relatedly, you also talked about factuality and objectivity. And I'm also wondering about how being so deeply embedded or, in contact, in conflict zones and part of people's struggles, how your understanding of those things have shifted over time, the idea of, objectivity or factuality. Thank you.
I like to say that I eat my feelings, so I deal with it with chocolate. But, listen, being objective and being human are different. Like, we are human beings, and you don't witness something that is terrible for somebody's nation, for somebody's family, and you say, well, I'm a journalist, and I do not cry. And I cry with people. I put my microphone down, my notebook down. I sit with people. And our reporting doesn't mean it has no feelings. And we are human beings, and the way that we tell stories is influenced by our own experiences and the experiences we witness. And so that definitely is displayed. And the idea of what objective, the cold, hard lens of journalism is shifting and changing because our lenses are different, depending.
And that is in itself a position.
A position, yeah. And I think newsrooms recognize that. We are fact-based, and it is our job to tell the most objective story, but also a truthful story. And acknowledging the fact that our newsrooms need to be more diverse is acknowledging that there is no one lens. And if a room looks one way, only one type of story will be told. And that's why I loved our Baghdad Bureau, because we purposely had a plethora of voices that represented the sects and ages and genders of that country, but also the types of journalists that exist here in the United States. The white man, the Arab woman, we had these people coming in and out of the Bureau. And so, of course, it shifts and changes, but I do believe in objectivity. We are not activists, we are not advocates. We are people who are trying to reflect what is happening on the ground. And that gets a lot of people angry with us, depending on what you might believe, because that doesn't mean it always confirms. And it challenges my own conceptions of what things are and what I thought things were.
On the first part about how do you keep going or something, for me, so I live in DC, we have all these great museums, and now we have the National Museum of African American History and Culture. One of my favorite exhibitions there is on the early Black press, and especially Ida B. Wells, but also people like Mary Shad Carey, and people who, I'm like, if you were a Black woman in the late 1800s, early 1900s, doing investigative reporting on lynching, I'm fine. I'm not going to complain. I have it so easy. And to know that she has a quote that said it's better to wear out than to rust out.
Yeah.
And so that's actually what I think about on those days when I'm so exhausted, or I can't talk to one more person who dehumanizes me, or whatever. It's like, yeah, this is a well-trod path that I'm walking on.
And there is a lot of shoot the messenger. I mean, everybody likes to come after you when they're angry about a situation, not because it's personal to you, but because you're part of an industry that they may hate in that day, or they're angry about whatever. There's a lot of that. But like you said, we have a platform and a responsibility, and it's a privilege to be able to, the amount of people who have welcomed me into their home, a complete stranger, and talk to me about their the most vulnerable moment in their life. What a privilege, and you need to honor that and respect that when you tell the story.
So unfortunately, we need to close here, but I do want to say that for students and faculty and staff in the audience, we have an event tomorrow from 3 to 4:30, which will be an informal coffee and question and answer session with Leila and Hannah. So that's in Humanities 2, room 259. And I also, from the bottom of my heart, want to thank all of you for coming and give our guests a final round of applause.
Thank you.